I love that slide there. Just bundles and bundles of cash.
You didn't see the text they wrote beside it?
What did it say?
Oh, God.
I wish somebody would just gift me a heap like that for New Year.
Hey, there's the picture illustrating what was written beside you. You didn't see what was written beside it?
No.
Oh, God.
I'm single-minded. I'm focused.
No wonder. You're a woman.
Now let's get down to business. The International Monetary Fund believes that 2023 is going to be a difficult year for many countries, many economies, that is. But the good news is that Nigeria is not counted among those countries.
The ones that will have it difficult.
They say so. Even though we are in debt already and our debt is now approaching 77 trillion. But, well, those are things that economists are going to explain to us in the course of today's program. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Teriba, CEO of Economic Associates. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us, sir.
And we also have joining us virtually Dr. Andrew Nevin, Advisory Partner and Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, we can't hear you yet, but we'll get to it.
Okay. Doctor, the good news says that Nigeria is not among the countries that are going to have a good time in 2023.
A difficult time.
Well, okay.
Please.
Difficult time in 2023. But the signs that we see as common people are not signs that lead to that kind of answer.
Oh, well, you have to read and contextualize what the IMF is saying very well. And so if you know, for example, health agencies warn that many people will, contract a particular disease next year, and then, give you a list of likely people who catch the disease, and you don't find some names there, it might be either because they will never catch the disease, or they have already indeed. So there's no warning for them.
They're already in it.
He that is down, basically.
Oh dear.
But is it really supposed to be comforting? Because over the years, it would seem like the opinion or economic advisory that is suggested to us as a nation by IMF or the World Bank or any of these multinationals, since as far back as I'm smart enough to know my left from my right, it would seem like those policies literally guide some of the economic policies or direction that we take as a nation. Is this something for us to worry about or something for us to cheer?
Well, it doesn't matter where the source of the advice is. You can advise yourself, and others can offer you opinion. At the end of the day, you should listen to all views and filter them and choose what's best for you. So anybody can warn, and you too can institute a watch, to try and see what risks and dangers are in the horizon, primarily to prepare to deal with them. So being told that the road ahead may be difficult doesn't mean that you won't get past the difficult phases if you prepare adequately for it. So
okay. So it sounds to me, Dr. Nevin, that it's perhaps, would you see it as one of those advisories that came from, for instance, the World Health Organization, that of what would happen to Africans in the wake of COVID-19, and that didn't happen? Is it something we should take in that light as well, or we should take this a little more seriously?
Well, I think that's a very good example with the WHO came out and had in 2020 dire predictions about Africa and the impact of COVID. And of course, it didn't come true. And one of the reasons it didn't come true is I don't think they really understood the conditions on the ground. I mean, with respect to the World Bank and the IMF advice, I mean, I'm not really sure that it's, particularly interesting advice. I mean, all of the technical issues, we have lots of very talented Nigerian economists, including Dr. Teriba, who's here with us today, and many others. They know what to do technically. So I'm not sure the advice, to be honest, is that helpful. I think Dr. Teriba is exactly right. Nigeria needs to find its own economic path. I don't think we've written, of course, as PwC, that the path is not like South Korea, it's not like Vietnam, it's not like Bangladesh. All those countries have done very well. But there's a different path for Nigeria based on the unique circumstances on that. So I don't think we should spend a lot of time really listening to the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, it was His Royal Highness Sanusi, His Royal Highness Mohammed Sanusi II, that when he was CBN governor, told me, said, Andrew, all of the successful countries in East Asia listen to the IMF and World Bank, pretend that they're going to do what they do and do something different that's right for them. So I think we're in the same situation, and Dr. Teriba is exactly right. It's not terribly relevant.
I think I'm happy that you put it that way. We should just chart our own economic path, right? And ignore, or maybe not give too much attention to whatever the IMF or the World Bank is saying. But it sounds like you're saying whatever they're saying is a guide, as Dr. Teriba has said. But let me just ask you, when you say Nigeria needs to create its own economic path, is that saying in any way that there isn't a clear economic path for Nigeria as a nation?
Well, I mean, we just put out the paper that gave a clear path to it. And what we said, I mean, I said a few minutes ago, our path is not like South Korea, which climbed up the manufacturing value ladder, or China did the same thing. We said, in fact, Nigeria's path should be more like India, in the sense that we should be exporting high value added services. That's the best way for us to diversify our export earnings. It's something that can done in a modular way. It's already happening. So there are a lot of people that come out and say, we need to start in low-end manufacturing. We put out a view that said that's not appropriate for Nigeria's conditions. I mean, we already compete on the service end of global value chains. We need to expand that. Companies like Outsource Global and Tex Expert in Abuja and Lagos, respectively, have over 1,000 seats each, growing very rapidly, and we can expand that. And India exports $200 billion worth of services. So we think that's the kind of path that Nigeria should follow, and not necessarily this low-end manufacturing on that. That's the view that we put out, which is very specific for the Nigerian conditions.
Dr. Teriba,
Yes,
I'm going to phrase this the same way that I phrased my opening question to you, because a lot of Nigerians are a bit worried when many of us mere mortals saw the budget and we saw a deficit of 12 trillion. How are we going to cope with this? Already we have a debt stock of 77 trillion. Then we
44 trillion. It's projected by May next year to reach 77.
Okay. Next year, that is this year?
This year.
Yes, by May this year. That's correct.
That's just
a few
technically
months.
4 months away.
That's right. If they succeed in issuing
the loan
that much.
All this seems very worrying to the mere mortal out there.
It's worrying. It's worrying to
gloom,
everyone.
gloom.
It's worrying, for everyone. But just like Andrew said, we shouldn't bewail the diagnosis. We should debate ways of solving the problem. Just like you deal with illness. At the end of the day, however severe the illness is, the important thing is to get the patient to recover. So Nigeria needs a conversation about how to stabilize the fiscal situation. It's an understatement to say that you have a fiscal crisis when our last actual revenue is the one we made in 2022, 6.5 trillion as of the end of November. So if you add another $500 billion for December, however you do it, you are not going to get much more than 7 trillion, 7.5 trillion. That's our revenue capacity. We are proposing to issue debt of nearly 12 trillion. Unfortunately, out of that 7 trillion revenue, we laid out 6 trillion on interest payment. So net revenue for us after paying interest was 1 trillion. In the end, we borrowed 7 trillion, so we could spend 8 trillion. The current capital, everything. So last year we spent 8 trillion. Although total spending was about 14 trillion, 6 trillion of it was just interest payment. So, and we are headed for the same scenario unless something is done differently. That's where we're headed.
Well,
in the new year.
Our crude oil production is rising gradually. Isn't that of any help?
Yeah, well, it's not of great help because the bulk of revenue projected for 2023, 80% of it is still going to come from non-oil. So what's coming from oil is put at 20% by the fiscal authorities. So what could we have done differently? Is it inevitable that Nigeria should have a debt stock of 77 trillion? Or what is going to be added from last year to this year, 33 trillion? Should Nigeria, be in a situation where, and that's the question, that maybe that's the debate that we should have engaged in maybe 8 years ago at the beginning of the current regime.
So let me ask you that question.
Yes.
Should Nigeria be having that kind of debt stock? At a time when the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning is saying we don't have a debt problem, we have a revenue problem.
We have both the revenue problem and the debt problem, in that the trend of revenue in the past 8 years have been decidedly downward, however you look at it. You may be under some illusion if you are looking at the Naira revenue, but once you convert into dollars or you correct for inflation, revenue has nosedived. Steeply, not just for the federal government, for other tiers of government. So we have a revenue problem, and that itself is globally induced. It's not just Nigeria, it's everyone, given what has happened to commodity prices, as we know. So you need a change of approach from the way you prospered when commodity prices were escalating. You are unlikely to prosper if you continue to do things that way.
Do you line up in any way with what Dr. Nevin was suggesting, that Nigeria should focus a little more on manufacturing and those such things, as was done by the Asian countries he sampled?
It's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. Nigeria should do what Andrew has suggested. But we are discussing the fiscal situation right now. What we're talking about is getting adequate revenue, and must we borrow so heavily? So what Nigeria did not do, that if you look at our peers, what they weren't doing then, which they started doing from like 2015, 2016, whether you're looking at Brazil or you're looking at India or you're looking at Saudi Arabia or now Egypt, they recognized the limits on revenue. And rather than jump into the debt market, they switched to an investment funding for their activities. So Nigerian government has issued nothing but debt in 8 years, as if equity market does not exist, either at home or abroad. So we issue the most expensive bonds at home, we issue the most expensive bonds abroad. We never issue equity. And if you look at the strong developing countries, it doesn't matter what you want to fund. You may want to fund infrastructure, you may want to fund manufacturing, you may want to fund health or education. They are looking more at getting investment, getting equity to fund government. Not about private companies attracting equity into private operations, but sovereigns opening portals. Like Nigeria, Brazil has the Partnership for Private Investment. It was introduced within the last 7 years. India has the India Investment Grid. It was introduced in the last 7 years. And the Saudi didn't even have a national privatization agency, but they've created one now. And they are creating a portal that looks like that of Brazil and that of... And Egypt is joining. Are we together? So we just want to do either revenue or debt. It has proved unsustainable. We should be looking at a financing mix that gives more weight to equity than debt. Nobody is going to scream if you say your stock of FDI is going to be 200 trillion next year. You'll be seen as a sign of strength, which is what our peers are boasting about. They're attracting more FDI as sovereigns. But everybody is screaming, your stock of debt will be 7 trillion, and your annual revenue is just 7 trillion. It's staggering.
It seems such a long way.
So you do have revenue problem, you have debt problem, you have debt cost problem.
Oh my God.
And somehow
our problems
they are solvable. They're solvable. We are projecting debt rising in 5 months.
5 months.
We could have been asking ourselves, what should we do to avoid that scenario? There could be things we can do today so that that prophecy will not become self-fulfilling. That projection will not materialize.
We will come back to you to ask you that question, but I need to ask Dr. Nevin this question. You mentioned the other time about us charting our own course, and you mentioned manufacturing. Manufacturing was a big thing in Nigeria in the 80s, and it just petered out, with many companies packing up and going to other West African countries. What things do you think that we can do to bring back manufacturing?
No, I think that's a very good question, and I think we need to be candid about what's happened here. So, I mean, we've had the incredible organization PEBEC for the last 7 or 8 years, headed by Dr. Jamoke. So this is to create better conditions for doing business, ease of doing business. The way I would characterize it is that the government, certainly at the federal level, has said all the right things about trying to create an enabling business environment, but the reality on the ground is it continues to be very harsh for many sectors, for all sectors, including particularly manufacturing. You know why manufacturing is so harsh? The infrastructure continues to be a problem. The power issue has not been solved in any substantive way. It's difficult to go in and out of the ports, both physically, but also in terms of dealing with Nigerian customs and the multitude of agencies on there. So it's not a very good environment for manufacturing. And until we kind of have an honest and candid conversation about it, I don't think we're going to make much progress. I think we've pretended that we've made progress on the ease of doing business, but we haven't made any real progress. And of course, the manufacturers have then voted with their feet and with their capital, and they've gone to other places in Africa, particularly with AFCFTA on the rise, and they can manufacture elsewhere. So I think unless the federal government, in conjunction with the states, is really committed to truly making changes in an enabling business environment, we're going to continue to have manufacturing struggle. But I mean, without power, without infrastructure, without a system of ports for both imports and exports for manufacturing, moving physical goods, it's not going to work. It's kind of a difficult situation for the country.
Well, you know, staying on that same issue, there are quite a number of things that would seem we perhaps, I mean, going by what you heard Dr. Teriba say, some things that we perhaps have left undone and some things we're doing that we shouldn't be doing. So it would seem like the cart and the horse are occupying either's place. So looking at it from the perspective that you said that your organization has looked at it, releasing a paper and all of that, what are the shortfalls? And what are the low-hanging fruits that you see? If that prophecy that Dr. Teriba is referencing is not going to come to pass, what are the shortfalls we have had now? And what do you think are the low-hanging fruits that we can catch up with within the next 3-4 months, so that in the 5th month of this year, we don't have that debt stock of 77 trillion?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, I think that we're in the camp with many other commentators about it, that we have the 3 big distortions, which are really the low-hanging fruit. And the most obvious distortion is the foil subsidy. Again and again and again, any study, any analysis of it shows that the foil subsidy benefits the rich or benefits those who essentially a corrupt system, whether it's subsidizing foil that doesn't exist or subsidizing foil that goes to other countries. I mean, it's consuming the nation. I mean, the official number is over 6 trillion, but that's done at the official exchange rate. It's actually larger. So we have this extraordinary situation where between the decline in oil price and the foil subsidy, essentially oil is contributing nothing to the economy when we only have 1.0, 1.1 million barrels a day of production. So that's the number one thing. I mean, we've also consistently been in the camp of exchange liberalization, and I know all the arguments against it. We understand people want to kind of have foreign exchange go to the highest value uses, but it's not something that really there's any evidence the government can control. It has so many knock-on effects with our current exchange regime, particularly because of this impact of round tripping on that and the corruption that goes with that. And the third one, of course, is the electricity tariffs. I mean, very difficult situation with the electricity tariffs. And it needs to be market-determined electricity tariffs. We've advocated for the electricity to actually be a state matter. States can figure out their own electricity needs, the technology they want to use, the structure they want, and they can wheel the tower in. And so those are the 3 distortions. But beyond that, I think once we get through those 3 distortions, then a real concerted effort to improve the business environment. And I think one aspect that's really critical is the Orange Shady report. I mean, it was produced in 2013. His Excellency President Buhari assented to it in 2020. We still have not seen any tangible results. I was reading this morning about an agency I'd never heard of and their activities, which seem to be things that this type of agency should not be doing. But with the complexity that we introduce to the environment here, we have, and I get different numbers for how many federal agencies, MDAs we have, whether it's 700, 1,000, 1,200. But it's just not a system that's going to be workable in terms of creating a conducive environment for economic growth. And to go back to the fiscal situation that you were discussing with Dr. Teriba, I mean, our view is it's not a revenue problem. It's really a growth problem. And we said 7 or 8 years ago, if we continue to grow at 2 or 3%, we would eventually have a fiscal crisis. And unfortunately, in all that 7 or 8 years, we've only grown, or even less sometimes, in the 1-point-something%. We haven't grown enough. And the result is we're now reaching that kind of fiscal crisis. But the only solution, in our view, is faster growth. I mean, we've always said we should have a minimum of 6 to 8%. His Excellency Governor Amafila at the CBN has come out and said we should be growing at double digit. And yet we still have the projections, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, I think came out yesterday and said the projection for 2023 in terms of growth is 3.7%. I mean, it's better than 2%, but it's still not nearly good enough. And we're going to continue to have a worsening fiscal situation unless we get growth up to 6 to 8%. And you can't, when she said there's a revenue problem, I understand what she's saying, but it's very difficult to take more revenue, more tax revenue out of a system that's not growing. So if it's only growing at 3%, I mean, it's barely keeping up with population. People's incomes are not getting higher per capita, and then you're trying to take more from their wallet. That's very difficult. Whereas if it's going at 6 to 8%, people are getting wealthier, and they'll understand the need to pay more taxes in that situation.
Well, it would seem like, I don't know, Dr. Teriba, there's so much. I mean, you both are raising issues that, I mean, it's a national symposium. There are topics enough for national symposium. So I'm just wondering, I mean, by the way, Dr. Nevin, that question you raised about the number of MDAs that we have is still bugging me as well. But the place that I would probably go to first is to ask the Auditor General's office which agencies collect money. Maybe that will give us an idea, because there are so many ministries, departments, and agencies that, for the life of me, I wonder where they are coming from. But to you, Dr. Teriba, one of the things that Dr. Nevin mentioned now is about the role that the states can play in all of this. The federal government can project all they want, but projecting a growth of 3% when we should actually be doing double digits. I've always contended that we are always on the fringes of recession, as far as I am concerned, at least from what I what I see, because when we fall into recession, we go by 1 or 2%. When we come out, we stay out by 1 or 2%. So for me, it's almost like we're always walking on the touchline of recession. But what role can the states play, or either collaboratively, or as regions, or even in collaboration with the federal government? I asked that question, Dr. Teriba, against the background of that information from the National Bureau of Statistics about the level of poverty in the states. There are states that have up to 90%, more than 90% multidimensionally poor people. As Dr. Nevin said, how much taxes can come from these people when the federal government is looking at revenues in that regard?
None.
The OPS is saying already they pay something in the region of 50 different taxes: federal taxes, state taxes, local government taxes, all by one company. So I'm wondering, in the light of that, what kind of collaboration is lacking and should get back on board in order for us to have some measure of economic equilibrium?
Right. Both the federal and subnational governments have different roles to play. There is very little that states can do about macroeconomic outcomes. In the realm of monetary, no state has a central bank.
I get
Nigeria only has one central bank.
Yeah.
And therefore, the business of managing the exchange rate and forex reserves has to be pitched at the national level.
Yes.
The same with the budget. I mean, the lion's share of the collective budget of the states is typically equal to that of the federal government. Until recent times, when the federal government could borrow without limits. So for the year 2023, the federal government is proposing to spend 21 trillion.
21.83.
The states are collectively spending 10 trillion. Okay, so for the first time, the states' collective spending power is just half of what the federal government is, assuming that the federal government finds the money to fund 20 trillion. And that they don't spend too much of a fraction of that on interest payment. However, at the state level, we are not talking about issues of macro stability. You have to encourage, the states have to encourage the federal government to create a stable macro climate, like this thing of don't issue too much debt, explore equity for the collective good of everyone. But states are closer to the people in that states deal with 4 issues. One, the minor one of the solvency of the state government itself, because the other 3 legs of the issues that states deal with, for example, physical capital or human capital or production value chains, all are dependent on the state remaining solvent. For the state to make sure that potholes are filled, you could reach your farmland, you could drive through the cities and the rest of it. So it starts with how do we ensure that states are solvent? Just as we are saying that we need to ensure that the federal government is liquid and is stable. States need to be solvent. And then federal government can do very little about the physical capital in each state. They can do very little about the human capital in each state. And they can do very little about the value chains situated in each state. You don't find all products in all states.
But essentially, it sounds like, my apologies, Dr.
into oil producing, agricultural, commercial.
It sounds like you are saying that the federal government has little to do with solving multidimensional poverty problems.
This is not about multidimensional poverty problems. You cannot ask Ogun State to come and cater for human capital in Lagos State You can't ask Lagos to go and cater for physical capital.
So
you can't tell Ogun State to come and do something about products that it doesn't have.
It's not a responsibility for the federal government. That's what you're saying.
That is closer to the state government.
Yeah.
The well-being of farmers in your state to make sure that the road gets from the city to the farm. Federal government will connect different states, but each state will have to connect the different local governments in its area. So the attention that what the bedrock of poverty is, to fight poverty, you have to give people skills that can earn them income. It's the bottom line of it. And if you sit down as a state and you watch large fraction of your workforce be rendered unemployed, either because of technological change or because of any shock, it could be even structural change. The economy is developing, and therefore certain skills that used to earn people income cannot earn them income anymore. For example, this threat of automation. You look at what has happened to drivers collectively. There used to be a major economic force. You get to any five-star hotel, you find half of the space is for taxis. You get to the likes of CMS, Marina, and where are they now? With the advent of the airports, the advent of ride sharing, it has destroyed their income base. No driver, you can't claim now that my service is better than yours. Each driver is a commodity. You all get the same rate from Uber. So now it's the duty of each state to be awake to the incidence of such developments on their populace and to reskill them, because as some jobs are being displaced, the demand for new ones are coming.
Yes.
So we don't pay attention to that in Nigeria. You get a lot from pay, but these things threaten that pay base. And if you look at this age when youths migrate, you watch any of the migrants, it really doesn't matter what it is they do in their destinations. If you watch them 6 months after they get there, whatever it is they are doing, they will be upskilling. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, you could say, well, I'm a carer, I'm not a registered this, I'm a security, I have now got this level of certification. We don't pay attention to that. Even when state government or federal government do entrepreneurship, programs, training programs, you asked, what level of certification? Is this stratified? Is there a progression whereby I do 3 months training, I know it has enhanced my ability to connect to income? Are we together?
Yes.
So federal government can't go into each state and be doing that.
I agree with you. I agree with you. But the point that the point that I believe you are making is, if the nation is going to be productive in terms of human capital, the states have to contribute. That's what you're saying.
Well,
primarily.
Wait. All tiers of government have to contribute. Okay. There are things that the federal government could do alone. There are things that, you have federal universities, you have state, and there are things that states. There are things that states must do alone, and there are things that they must do in concert. And there are also things that local government. But the point is that the relative responsibility of each across activities will not be always the same.
But Doctor, my apologies, Dr. Nevin said something very, very interesting, which is why I'm trying to get this. He said, Alero asked that question again about us returning to manufacturing, which according to Alero worked for us way before now. And these things happen in the states. Even the federal government is located in states, well, except Abuja. So that's the reason that I'm asking that question. If the states have their own roles cut out for them, is that collaboration, that national vision that we're all working towards?
Andrew addressed the subject. And one of the things he said is about the lack of competitiveness. Unless you can guarantee the adequate supply of energy,
yeah,
and you can guarantee seamless transportation, you'll be discussing manufacturing in vain, because the costs will make that activity unreasonable.
And that is a federal government responsibility.
Collective, who solved telecoms problem? Is it federal government? It's a collective responsibility, but will be spearheaded, at the federal level. The point is, you need to sequence. You have certain prerequisites that you must put in place before you can expect manufacturing to happen.
To thrive.
For example, 20 years ago, our telecom sector was in infancy. So you can't be talking of ICT, or you can't be talking about e-business growing.
Then
telephones have to ring first.
Yes.
Then you can talk about data.
Yes.
Then you can talk about building structures on it. So it was wise of Nigeria to resolve telecoms in 2001. And we are on the path in which you've seen explosion, new ways of creating wealth and connecting with the world. So it would be wise for Nigeria to turn attention to the other things that need to be fixed. For example, power transmission.
Yeah.
For example, rail transport. If you were doing telecoms the way you are doing rail now, you were going to borrow from a particular country to build, piecemeal, build the telecoms network. You will not have got anywhere. You haven't got anywhere with rail. Use the approach that you used in telecoms, in which you open to investors, and they've, saturated the space. Do it in rail, do it in transmission, liberalize, attract investment. It's going to solve the fiscal problem. It's going to solve the infrastructure problem. It's going to empower manufacturing, etc. Basically, that's the kind of conversation. There are things we must do in concert, but after the concerted effort has been taken, there are things that each state must then zoom in on. This is what affects me, this is what I can do to create a difference, not just to human capital, to physical capital. Each state, the federal government is not going to come and help you to solve the reason why your own central business districts or your city centers are not safe, or why they are dirty. You can generate economic activity just by restoring orderliness at these market centers, whether you do Igbo, my too. So as long as the nuisance in those spaces are there, they will obstruct wealth creation, and your people will be the poorer for it.
Dr. Nevin, both of you have agreed that our problem is a revenue problem. And you also pointed out that, or was it Dr. Teriba, pointed about taxation, that there's no point in increasing taxes when people's incomes are not increasing. In fact, their spending is increasing, but their incomes are not increasing. So let's look at this revenue problem, which you both have spoken about. How can Nigeria begin to shore up its revenue, seeing that its expenditure in the budget is so high?
Yeah, very good question. But I mean, let's start with the fact that why do some people, we have low tax morale, as my colleague Taiwo calls it in our studies at PwC. Why do people have low tax morale? They have low tax morale because there's the perception that the tax money is not used wisely. So we look over the last number of years, we continue to pour subsidies into Ajinokuta steel, and there's no steel. In fact, it was just reported that the nation spent $100 million resolving legal issues to be able to move forward. We continue to subsidize the refineries, and there's no refined product. We continue to spend over 6 trillion naira this year last year on the foil subsidy on that, which is, we talked about as a complete waste. So, and then we have this multiplicity of agencies. And of course, when people pay their taxes, they don't get a commensurate level of services. They don't get education, they don't get health care, they don't get infrastructure, they don't get security, they don't get energy in sort of electric access. So then they go out and have to pay themselves that. So in a sense, there's this myth, and the World Bank has contributed, that we're a low tax environment and we need to collect additional tax revenue. But that, in fact, is completely false. I mean, as we said on the show today, there's over 50 different taxes. There's a lot of charges that are not called taxes. They're just called fees in some way for a particular MDA. There's informal charges. And then once you pay all of those charges and taxes, you then have to go out and supply all those services that, in fact, the taxes are supposed to be paid for. So it's a very difficult situation on that fiscal side from that. And in that environment, I mean, I don't think the federal government should be looking at this as a revenue problem. They should be looking at it as the wisdom of their spending. I mean, if we're going to have people willingly pay their taxes and be prepared to pay more taxes, there has to be the perception that the taxes are used wisely. And as we continue to divert them into things that are not productive for the nation, I mean, we've said before, we put out the paper that said Nigeria is a very rich country. We have an enormous amount of assets, particularly real estate, but these are dead assets that are not producing a return for the country, like Agio Foods and Steel on that. So rather than try to extract more from the population in the way of revenue growth, I think the better solution would be to be able to tell a better story to the population about how the existing taxes are being used, and to convince people, in fact, that the social contract is one that is fair. But right now, there's the perception that the money that's raised from the population is not used wisely. In that circumstance, it's very difficult to try to raise more money. So in that way, I think that the federal government has not necessarily addressed the core issues around the taxation and the fiscal issues.
Okay, so that is that. But then it also, I don't know what your take would be on the conversation. I mean, you raised the issue of the responsibility of the states, or rather the collaboration or contribution of the subnationals to national GDP and all of those things. I heard some of the things that Dr. Teriba said about that, what role the states have to play, especially about empowering people and all of that. So I'm wondering if there is anything, any direct, because my challenge hitherto had always been that of a need for some form of national cohesion. So the different states know what to contribute into the pool so that we can all be going in the same direction.
Yeah, so let me just start out by saying, I mean, I've raised a lot of the challenges that the country faces, but I mean, these challenges are all well known. I personally remain incredibly optimistic about the future of Nigeria. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because, in fact, in the last decade, we've really seen the states step up, some of the states step up and really show how they can develop their own states. And if I had to take an analogy, when India had a major economic crisis in the early 1990s, they actually had to airlift their gold to the Geneva vaults to get a loan from the IMF. And they basically said to the states, you need to start to figure out your own economic strategy. And that has worked out incredibly well for them in the last 30 years. And I was just in India. I think I was in 5 different states in my time over the holiday. And each state has a different strategy, economic strategy. Some states are starting to do incredibly well. But we're beginning to see that here. And I'll cite Edo State as an example, His Excellency Governor Obaseki. I mean, let me give you 3 economic pillars that he has that are working very well. One of them is around agriculture and agro value chains and being able to attract investment, particularly around palm oil. One of them is around cultural industries, the new museum that's opening up in Benin City, and of course the return of Benin bronzes, and incredible story to tell about the Benin Empire. The third one is about upskilling young Nigerians to be able to insert themselves in global value chains as developers, software developers. He has a target of 35,000 young people for that. But the point I want to make is he has an economic strategy, the state has an economic strategy, and it's being executed, and that's where value is going to be created. And every state has different attributes that they can draw on. Kaduna has a very strong economic strategy. Of course, Lagos has been doing this for 20 years. Ogun is very strong in education and manufacturing. And more states you're finding have governors that recognize unless they take the responsibility for their economic strategy, the states are not going to develop. So at one level, it's also important for the population of each state to elect governors who are going to advance the state's interests. So Dr. Teriba is exactly right. We need the states and the federal government working together. But I think it's been very encouraging. We have now His Excellency Governor Saludo in a number, for example, who has put together a very good economic strategy, and I think have no doubts it's going to be successful. And as more and more states take responsibility for their own economic future, then I think we're going to find Nigeria emerges much stronger over the next decade. So I'm very optimistic about that. And one of the things that's interesting, or I've been a little bit critical of the World Bank on this program and at other venues, but I think one thing the World Bank has done very well is recognize the incredible role of subnationals in Nigeria. I think that this was the first country, because the World Bank normally works World Bank with the federal government in every country. This was the first country, if I understand right, where the World Bank started to work with the subnationals, and that has been very, very successful in many ways in terms of their fiscal frameworks for subnationals, their economic strategy for that, on that. So I'm really optimistic about it. I think more and more states are going to end up with governors that are moving them in the right direction, and they're going to have their own distinctive economic strategies. We were at an amazing session, for example, that was run by Francis, who was just stepped down as the head of the AFCFTA Secretariat in Nigeria. And he brought the states together for the states to figure out what is their strategy in the context of AFCFTA. So this is not what is Nigeria's strategy. This is at an individual state level. We have a continental free trade agreement. What can your state do to that? And the results were really, really promising about it. So it really gives me cause for optimism in Nigeria.
Well, Dr. Teriba, these issues are just not going to go away. Now, Dr. Nevin spoke about some low-hanging fruits the other time. That, I mean, there was something you said earlier, my colleague Alara said, we'll come back to it. What are those things we need to do in order to shoot down those prophecies?
Right. I'd like to say a bit more on two of the issues that Dr. Nevin has put on the table regarding the government revenue mix. Okay. So we see the government, federal and state, striving to get more revenue through taxes. Unfortunately, the tax base is shrinking. The economy has been in recession for most of the past 8 years. So even if you, do annual finance acts, point is, this year, from the energy shock, from the food shock, you need to go and try and find out how many factories have shut down and how many workers have been quietly laid off. You read global headlines, about tech companies shedding workers. You are not going to read any headline about, companies in Lagos, companies in Ibadan shutting down. They shut down quietly. So by the time you finish doing your finance act, the corporates that you expect to pay the taxes have shut down. The staff that you expect to pay the taxes have been laid off. So you're not going to get more from tax revenue. Now, you have to then compare. There are some countries that do not rely on taxes. Is that people pay no income tax, corporate taxes are low or zero. Yet they get more funding, they get more revenue, government revenue, than those of us that talk about tax. UAE just scrapped 30% tax on alcohol. Okay, we are introducing tax on alcohol, on sugar, on tobacco. So what sustains them? What makes them able to do? So the government in such climes focus on assets, just like Andrew has said, how to get fees on government assets, whether the assets are tangible or intangible. The kind of licensing fees that individuals who don't pay taxes in UAE will pay will be more than enough to compensate for the fact that you don't pay taxes. The kind of fees that companies have to pay to operate will be more than enough to and then they get those fees up front. Whereas you have to wait and get taxes in arrears. That's if you get it. Are we together? So we need to think more about assets. If you look at assets that litter across all the states, he has mentioned real estate. Which state is making any reasonable sum of money from real estate? They own the bulk of it. So if you find any real estate that is yielding high returns, is probably not owned by the state. So we are talking of the value of real estate lies in this place value. So if you have a mall where a lot of billions have been unlocked per square meter, it's not owned by the state. If it were owned by the state, it would be clogged down by disorder, human traffic competing with vehicular traffic,
hoodlums and privileges,
hoodlums, So if states can pay more attention to that, it doesn't have to be shopping malls run by private sector alone that can unlock wealth. That government overseen markets. You don't have to run it yourself. You can do PPP. You can contract agents that will run those spaces the way private sector will run. If you need, if you have a 5-star hotel or 7-star hotel that is thriving in some other countries, states rival, with private sector. If you find residential area that are sane and normal, well organized, creating wealth, it's in the private hand. And that applies to all of the states. In the past, states, regions, for example, Western region, if we were looking for best examples in real estate, it was the government. If we were looking for the best hotels, it was the government. Are we together?
Doctor, well, you are the people who also say that government has no business in business.
Government has every business in business. You can do
the mantra has changed.
You can do public-private partnership. You are doing joint venture in LNG. So, and you've liberalized investment in telecoms. So why neglect real estate? Why waiting for tax revenue when you can make money from you have tourist centers that is owned by government, will always be owned by government. If you look at other countries, they've contracted private managers who secure the space, they make them safe. They amenitize the place. Are we together?
Yeah.
So basically, then when you talk about manufacturing, you talk about value. At the end of the day, is also the extent to which the farmers in your state or the artisans in your state are protected by the state. We talked about skill certification, but also they need some protection in terms of the supplies that they get, unless the state supports them. They need some protection in terms of access to the market. Your populace is in rivalry with corporate, particularly foreign corporate giants who confine them to the farmland or confine them to the factory. But the biggest gains are outside of the factory, either before the factory or in the approach to the market from the factory. The same with the farm. So unless states secure advantages for their citizens, working in those spaces, we keep talking vaguely about, agriculture, talking vaguely about manufacturing. And foreign companies will come and cut the surpluses away and leave the populace perpetually impoverished. And I also see the example of the Western region in those days. They were creating, value chains of their own. They were branding, products. The Western region had Lafayette Canning factory, which is Foreman today. It's been privatized. And a lot of other interventions in different value chains. So states can't sit back and wait for the private sector to do it and tax them. States also has to join the fray. And he mentioned dead assets. How much money can we generate from our idle assets? We're talking of Finance Act. How soon will we be talking about Investment Act to make sure that we talked about real estate, but there is infrastructure, and we have companies whose market value we don't even know. All that Saudi, has done to reveal the value of Aramco in his balance sheet is to list it in the stock market.
But you haven't spoken about those things that you said we needed to do. You wanted to talk about that earlier.
That's all I've been saying.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure that, that's out of the bag because you started by addressing...
Okay, so should I itemize?
We must...
Should I itemize?
Itemize quickly.
Complement fee-based revenue, complement tax-based revenue with fee-based revenue. And attract investment into assets. Investment when it arrives, is revenue.
Yeah.
And if you successfully revive a debt asset, for example, when you attracted LNG, the investment into LNG, from nothing, they brought out something. It opens up new revenue streams. The telecoms company did that. So when investment arrives, it gives revenue on arrival. It then opens up new revenue streams that didn't exist before. So we're saying debt, we are going to borrow the money to invest in infrastructure, draw a curtain on that model. Investors are better able to invest in infrastructure than you. Okay, you don't need to borrow 30-year money at 8%, dollar money. So what kind of infrastructure is going to yield such return? But investors know how to get lumpy sums and put. We got in telecoms, we should get in rail, in transmission, and the rest of it.
I will ask this question in parentheses. Ayo said something about multiple taxation. Some companies are paying as many as 30 different taxes.
50.
Is it that government is not aware that that is killing business?
Oh, well, this is where acting in concert is important. Each government is trying to survive. They're feeling the pinch of declining revenue, and they have to survive. So
well, the companies are also feeling the pinch.
You have to understand where they are coming from. So that's not to say, so unless you all, what's the motivation in UAE for scrapping 30% alcohol tax? They obviously have seen that it is in their interest to scrap it. They probably get more revenue by scrapping it, because it will encourage more tourists, they say, to come to, to the UAE, so and the more tourists you get. So the states, we should have a conversation such that states can also see the benefit of tax relief, and how tax relief could boost some other revenue inflow, even when such revenue inflow are not taxes.
Okay, we've run completely out of time. So, Dr. Nevin, may I have your last word on Nigeria's spending in 2023? In 1 minute, please.
Dr. Nevin.
We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay,
no, go ahead. I'm here. Just please repeat the question.
Your last word on Nigeria's spending in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all understand the budget is about 20 trillion, and we continue to have almost 4 trillion that goes on to the foil subsidy. I think we have close to 6 trillion, if I remember right, on interest payments. So, not a lot of spending left for other things. But as I said a little bit earlier in the program, I mean, I really think that this debate is too often around the micro details of the budget and not enough about the overall social contract between people that are governed and people paying taxes and the government. And I think the government has not in the last number of years addressed the fundamental issues, either with what I discussed before in terms of ease of doing business, where they talk about it but haven't addressed it, nor have they really addressed it in terms of the spending priorities. We all understand how much, for example, NAS costs. We understand the multiplicity, the cost, the multiplicity of the agencies. We understand the cost of things like Ajacuza Steel and the refineries. And because the government has not addressed those fiscal issues that are wasteful and not really advancing the country socially or economically, the people are rightly asking the question about whether they should pay more money. And I think unless they address the fundamental issues, the next regime that comes in, we're going to continue to struggle in Nigeria. I think the good news, though, however, is that the fact that these issues are so well known, the debates are all about really the core issues. I think many people understand the need to address real fundamental reform in whatever form it takes. As I said, I continue to be very optimistic over the next decade for Nigeria.
Oh, okay, we hope we can all be optimistic. Dr. Teriba, the last word, please.
Oh, well, that it's important, not to put the cat before the horse. Budgets in Nigeria tend to have more to say on sectoral allocation of money than on where to get the money from. And at the end of the day, you have a capital spending plan of 6 trillion and you can't even spend 2 trillion out of it. Government should pay more attention to where to find revenue by looking at what they can get from assets from fees. And government should maybe declare a ceasefire on debt issuance and issue only equity so that they get on the same page with our peer countries who are getting a lot more from investment. India targets 100 billion FDI inflow annually. And Brazil is not doing any poorly. Saudi is joining, Egypt is joining. Nigeria should join that free.
Dr. Ayo Teriba, CEO of Economic Associates, who was with us in our studio in Lagos, as well as Dr. Andrew Nevin, Advisory Partner and Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
For coming to keep our eyes focused on our spending in 2023.
Interestingly, we didn't talk about this election spending, but that's not part of the conversation, so we can go. Don't look at me like that. Thank you.
Sunrise will be right back in a moment with another interesting conversation. Do join us.